Our reading tonight, if you have a Bible, is 1 Samuel chapter 24, and the words are going to come up on the screen. 1 Samuel 24 goes like this. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is here in the desert of En-gedi. So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. He came to the sheepfolds along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. The men said, This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. I don't know if anyone's ever visualized that. There you go. Just have that image in your head. Afterwards, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. With these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went on his way. Then David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, My Lord the king. When Saul looked behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He said to Saul, Why do you listen when men say, David is bent on harming you? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord gave you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lay my hand on the Lord's anointed. See, my father, look at this piece of your robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but did not kill you. See that there is nothing in my hand to indicate that I'm guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I've not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between you and me. May the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you. As the old saying goes, from evildoers come evil deeds. So my hand will not touch you. Against whom has the king of Israel come out? Who are you pursuing? A dead dog? A flea? May the Lord be our judge and decide between us. May he consider my cause and uphold it. May he vindicate me by delivering me from your hand. When David finished saying this, Saul asked, Is that your voice, David, my son? And he wept aloud. You're more righteous than I, he said. You've treated me well, but I have treated you badly. You've just now told me about the good you did to me. The Lord gave me into your hands, but you did not kill me. When a man finds his enemy, does he let him get away unharmed? May the Lord reward you well for the way you treated me today. I know that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. Now swear to me by the Lord that you will not kill off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's family. So David gave his oath to Saul. Then Saul returned home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. Today, I want to talk to you on the subject of mercy over enemies. We're in a series over August looking at the life of David and thinking about lessons that we can learn from David. And today, we're looking at this story of David and Saul. And in our passage, there are three types of enemies. And the first type of enemy is personal enemies. That's like nemesis. You know that person that you really hate. You know, it's like I can't think of any superhero who hates another superhero. It's like Thanos and the Avengers. There we go. It's like they hate each other. They're personal enemies. They can't stand each other. Here's the scene. David, who's been chosen to be king, the king of Israel, he's being pursued by the actual king of Israel, Saul. And to complicate things, David and Saul, they used to be really close. In fact, David would play harp for Saul when Saul was feeling angry or stressed. David would come in and he'd play harp. He was like that playlist on Spotify, Coffee Chill or whatever it's called, that you put on when you're feeling a bit stressed. He was that for Saul, and they were really close. Actually, they were so close. David and one of Saul's sons, Jonathan, were like best friends. They were the best of friends. But now Saul had made up his mind to kill David. He was hunting him down. Saul had decided that David was his enemy. And in verse 4, we read this. The men, that's David's men, said to David, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give you your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish." David's enemy, Saul, has been given to David in his hands, and David is left with a choice. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty rubbish at making enemies. I'm a little bit like some people kind of personality type tests, all that kind of stuff. If I was to invent one, it would be dogs. So it'd be like, what kind of dog are you? And I'm like a Labrador. So I just love people. I'm kind of like, oh, people. And I kind of roll over and you could stroke my belly. So I find it quite hard to make enemies. But I know lots of people do kind of make enemies. And sometimes people might annoy me a little bit. But I realized recently that I do have some enemies that are quite close to me, very close to me. So my family and I, we moved into a new house about 5 months ago, and we're doing lots of work in the garden, digging up borders and doing lawns and laying stuff in the... I don't really understand. It's done. It's nearly done now. It feels great. Anyway, once we dug up this border, and we noticed after about a week of just having the soil kind of open, that there was flies all over the soil. And I thought, oh, well, maybe the flies like worms or something that's brought them out, or maybe they just like flies like open soil. And my kids love digging. We've got 2 little kids, and they love digging in anything that makes them filthy, to be honest. So they love anything that makes them dirty. And they were digging in this soil, and it was raining a bit. They're kind of covered in it. And I noticed this smell. And it wasn't really a smell that you want your children digging in. And after a while, I kind of had a look. And I realized that there was loads of poo in the border. I was like, how does that get there? There's no way it could be a dog, because our house is kind of enclosed. There's no way a dog could get in. And I don't think it's one of us. Better not be. And then I thought, well, it could be a fox. There's loads of foxes. But actually, our walls are so high and there's trellises all around that if it was a fox, I mean, that would be a good effort from the fox. And so we shoveled it all out. We got rid of it. And I thought, I need to wait for my enemy to come and relieve itself. So I waited outside one night. And I waited. And I was told I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to say it. I had a rock in a hand. And I was waiting for my enemy to come. And then I saw it coming across the wall, a big, fat cat. And it jumped down, and I was like, I'm going to get you. And I kind of launched the rock half-heartedly at the cat, because I thought, I don't like cats anyway, but if I hit it, it's not good. I don't want to have to bury a cat in my garden. So I kind of half-launched a rock towards the cat and then chased it with a hose pipe. I was like, I don't mind getting it wet and scaring it. And it ran away. Anyway, we turned our garden into Fort Knox, and now, if there's a chance... there's no chance a cat's going to get in there. It's not happening. They're not getting in. I was left with an opportunity of how to deal with my enemy. A bit like David and Saul. Came to relieve itself, he came to relieve himself, and we're there. I acted very differently. And there are lots of different ways we can deal with enemies. I dealt with the cats, like David's men, as I would wish. They're not coming back. And maybe you're here today and you've got an enemy. It could be someone else in your life. It might not be a cat. You might love cats. It might be a dog. But it might be someone else in your life. It could be a colleague at work, someone who you're kind of toe-to-toe with, in competition with, and you just always just seem to fight. You just can't get on with them. They're like an enemy to you. Or it could be a tricky boss. It could be an ex from a relationship, or it could be someone you're in a relationship with. You just feel like you're enemies. And maybe you're looking for a way to get that person back. You're looking for a way to get them, to deal with them. And the response we see from David is really interesting. So we've got to understand the context a little bit, and we mentioned it a little bit earlier, but David's... he'd been anointed by someone called Samuel, who was the prophet of Israel, and Samuel had had effectively chosen David as king. God had chosen David as king, and Samuel had anointed him with oil. This was a really important symbolic ceremony that had happened to David. And David had been chosen as the king, but there was another king at that time, Saul. And we're in this liminal moment in David's life where he's been told he's going to be the king, but he's not the king, and there's another king, and he's waiting to become the king. David has fled from Saul, who kind of turned his heart against God. He had the kingdom that was his, and he's going to cause harm to David. So David flees. He flees into the wilderness, and he puts together a little militia. He's got this kind of army. And actually, for all intents and purposes, David was well within his right to perform some kind of coup, like a military coup or a political coup. He had political favor in the government, in the royal family. He had political favor with the people, and he had this small militia of pretty effective fighting men. He could, and it was well within his rights, to take over and seize power for himself, to take hold of the royal robes of Saul, to kill Saul and to put them on himself. He could well have done it. But David did something else. He chose a narrower path. Instead of seizing power, he shows mercy to his enemy, to Saul. And maybe you're here today and you've got an opportunity, tomorrow at work to throw that tricky colleague kind of under the bus. Or you're looking for a perfect situation to do it. What we can learn from this passage is that it's better to trust God and to show mercy. I just caveat that by saying if any relationship that you're in is kind of not helpful, is harmful, is abusive in any way, the most merciful thing to do is to leave, is to get proper help. Well, here we're talking, it's not weakness that David's showing, it's courage, it's strength. And what happens to David, and we know this because we've got the context of the whole Bible, is that this moment of mercy unlocks a future for David. It unlocks a courageous future for him. But it doesn't just unlock David's destiny as the future king. It's healing as well, and it's the same for you and for me today. If you're presented with an opportunity to get one back on your personal enemy, to choose mercy won't just unlock a future for you, a better future, a brighter future. It's also healing. It's like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die is a bit like unforgiveness. When we forgive, when we show mercy, we ourselves are healed. It's the first type of enemy, personal enemies. The second type of enemy is we'll call them enemy of the state or enemies of the institution. In Ukraine right now, there are people who are defending their homes against other people who they see as their enemies. On September the 11th, 2001, nearly 3,000 people died or were killed by terrorists who saw America as their enemies. There may be faces to the enemy, but what enemies of the institution is it represents like forces beyond our reckoning. Beyond you or I, beyond our reckoning, there are forces that are so intense we could never fight them by ourselves. But there are other things that isn't just kind of conflict. Things like racism. 75 years ago, the Windrush generation arrived in the shores of the United Kingdom. And to our shame, as a Church of England church, many Church of England churches closed their doors and said, you are not welcome here. And this, the technical term people would say white privilege, the fact that if you're white, you have a certain privilege, has continued throughout the decades, still happens today. It's not just racism, there are other things. If you're born in Gateshead or in the northeast of England, you are more likely than anyone else to be born into poverty than anyone else in the United Kingdom. In Myanmar right now, if you're not ethnically Burman or Buddhist, you're likely to be persecuted because of your race and your religious beliefs. There are these forces of evil that happen in our world. that represent like institutional forces that you or I, on our own, we can't deal with them at all. And in our passage today, Saul represents an enemy of the state. Saul represents the kingdom of Israel gone completely wrong. It's gone wrong on his watch. He didn't seek the Lord with his whole heart. And because of that, the kingdom slid from a kingdom that should have been great to something that was not great, a kingdom of injustice, of oppression. And what David represents is the kingdom of justice, a place where slaves aren't oppressed, where the foreigner is welcome, where women are treated with dignity, where children are cared for. And David, in the face of the state of Israel gone completely wrong, the enemy of the state, felt completely hopeless. And actually, for most of David's life, he felt hopeless. But in the life of David and in this passage, we get a model for how to deal with enemies of the state. We get a window into the heart of David in the Psalms. Many of them begin with David lamenting his own circumstances. In Psalm 18, verses 16 to 17, we read these words. He, it's talking about God, and it may well be about this very situation that we've read. He reached down from on high. He took hold of me. He drew me out of deep waters. He rescued me from my powerful enemy, from my foes who were too strong for me. David trusted that God would reach down and rescue him from his enemies, from those who were too strong for him, from those forces that were set against him. And maybe you're here today and you're looking at your situation, whatever it is. You may have just got that email through on Friday from the energy company saying how much they're going to hike your bill up. Or you may have gone and done your big shop and you're looking at the bill and you're thinking, I don't know how I'm going to be able to afford this any longer. Maybe you've suffered another kind of injustice and you're thinking, God, these forces are too strong for me. I don't know what to do. Today, you can trust that God will reach down. He will take hold of you and he'll draw you out of the deep waters. You can trust in one of two things. Firstly, that God will do it now, that he will find a way. And to be honest, that's the one I want. But also, there's an eternal hope going on here. The book of Revelation, chapter 7, verses 16 and 17 says this. They, that means us, shall hunger no more. They shall thirst no more, for God will wipe away every tear from their eye. If you're facing trouble and hardship, you can trust that God, one day, he will right every wrong. He will make every sad thing come untrue. Every hardship will become easy. And it's hard to think like that, but you can know it. As a Christian, as someone who has Christ in you, you can know that you have an eternal destiny with him. And for those of us here today, and maybe you don't actually, you're doing all right at work, money's okay, you're like, oh, the cost of living crisis is, I can get through it, it'll be okay. Maybe you don't feel subject to a great injustice. See, David's action here is really interesting. He challenges Saul by calling out Saul's actions. Verse 12 says this, may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me. And if you're here today and you feel like you've got a bit of breathing space, or you don't feel like you're subject to injustice, you can challenge injustice on every level. That is the job of the church. If you see racism, to call it out, to care for the poor, to care for the needy. And this isn't just kind of justice posturing. It's not just being woke. This is really important. This is kind of bread and butter work of the Christian. This is what we are here to do. Amos 5 says, let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. This is an active choice for the Christian to do. And it's not as if you do it just because you have to. And we don't just do it for people who we don't know. Around this room today, there will be people who will be dealing with these issues. And there'll be people who have the capability to go into bat for that person. So wherever you're sat here today, you can know that someone else has your back. And if you're here today, you can look around and you can have someone else's back. It's an amazing challenge. And as we do this together, it's like the force of evil are driven back by the unity of God's people. The second enemy is enemies of the state. And the third enemy, the final type of enemy we see in our passage today, is enemies of the mind. David struggled, we know that from his life, with his mind, with his conscience, but also with his mind and with his actions. And as a result of his actions, again with his mind and with his conscience, and a lot of the time David seems to be in an awful kind of mess in his head. He struggled with guilt in our passage today. He was tempted by the choice to kill Saul. And you can see this happening. Saul's there, he's vulnerable, David's there, his men are behind him saying, go on, kill him, take his robes, do it, do it, do it. He'd be tempted to do it. And he cuts off a part of Saul's robe, which we learn is not a good thing to do because he's guilt-stricken by it. Verse 5 says this, afterwards David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. In the Message version, it says that David felt guilty. And maybe you're here today and you're feeling guilty. It might be something that you've done, maybe a long time ago, and you feel guilty about it. Or maybe it's something that you did this morning and you just feel guilty about it. Maybe it's a pattern, like a thing that you just can't help but do. And you feel guilt and shame about it. Or maybe it's false guilt. Maybe you tell yourself that you're the problem with the world as a way of kind of soothing yourself and making yourself feel a bit better. It's like self-pity. Oh, poor me. Everything's terrible. It's all my fault. Maybe you're dealing with that. Maybe it's an issue of identity. Maybe it's an issue of anxiety. You know Monday morning is coming tomorrow, and there's that meeting at work, or there's that client to deal with, or there's all of that work that you haven't done, and you can just feel the anxiety rising up. Or maybe it's like that bill that you don't want to open, or that email that you don't want to look at, and you're just letting it rise and rise. You're dealing with these issues. I personally often deal with these with issues in my mind. I sometimes find myself all wrapped up just in my own thoughts, dealing with these things. And there's loads of different ways to deal with it. Personally, I found one thing that's been very helpful has been seeing a therapist, actually. Just a little bit every now and then, just to talk through some of these issues. But there's another way to deal with these issues. In the life of David, we learn there's a model of how we can deal with these issues, the enemies in our mind. David knew he was fallen. He knew he was broken. He knew he was unworthy. Check. If you don't think any of those things, then maybe you need to do a little bit more self-introspection. But even though David knew that, he knew where to turn. In his dialogue with Saul, David time and again shows that he's trusting the Lord to have his back. He's trusting in God. David ran towards God to be his refuge. And in David running to God, showing mercy, in leaving it be and letting God do the work, he runs to God. There's a model for us. You see, there was another, a bit like David, who came a bit later, who didn't take a little piece of royal robe, but had the whole robes pushed on him by someone else. He had a crown of thorns pushed into his head. And on the cross, Jesus Christ, he died for you and for me. He opened wide his arms of love upon the cross so that you and me, we could run into those arms. But more than that, he runs towards us. And as Jesus died, he defeated all of those enemies. And as he rose, the Bible uses this phrase where it says, the enemies became his footstool. That means they're subject to him. They do what he says now. He's in command. He's in control. So for all of the enemies that you might have in your mind, you can know that they've been defeated. You can know that God's in control now, and you can yield to him. You can run to him. His arms are wide open for you to run to. For all of the institutional mess in the world, for the enemies, the evil forces that push the world back, you can run into Jesus' arms, into the arms of a Savior who's got you. We're going to pray in a moment. As we do, why don't you just bring to mind, there might be one thing that you've got on your mind. It might be like an enemy, someone who you can't stand. Bring them to mind. You might be dealing with unforgiveness. Or maybe you're stressed about these enemies of the institution. It could be you read the news and it just stresses you out. Or it could be finances and the cost of living that just feels like an enemy to you at the moment. Or it might be in your mind. You might just be worried about things, anxious about things. You might look in the mirror and not know who you are. Or maybe you never look in the mirror because you find yourself on your phone all the time, and that's your mirror, and you don't really know who you are anymore. Just bring that thing to mind, that person to mind. And the band are going to come up in a moment. We're going to respond with a song. But just bring that to mind and know that those enemies have been defeated. The forces behind them have been defeated. And actually, in a way, you've been defeated as well. That there's nothing really you can do in this situation, but there's everything that God can do in this situation. So run to him, because his arms are open wide and he loves you. If you want to stand, we're going to worship together.